Thank you. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. I want to say thank you to the Hudson Library. My wife and I, who joined me here tonight, we had a chance to walk around the library. My goodness, this is just such an incredible library. We went over to the children's section. So I think my wife is going to be looking on Zillow during my talk, because this is, you have a pretty wonderful community here. So thank you for inviting me here tonight. So I want to talk to you about a few friends of mine, the family of Theodore Roosevelt. We're going to be talking tonight for about 30, 40 minutes, and then I'd love to take your questions. I'm going to talk about Martha Bullock Roosevelt. I'm going to talk about Theodore Roosevelt Sr., who was also known as Thee. Anna Roosevelt Cowles, who was known as Bamie. Of course, Theodore Roosevelt himself and his brother Elliot, and his sister Conie, Corrine Roosevelt Robinson. These collectively are the Roosevelt family. And the subject of the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt. The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt argues that the most masculine president in the American memory was actually the product of women. Here we go. We're going to make the case. I'm going to turn you into a believer. His two sisters, his two wives, and his mother. And as all things do in life, it begins with this incredible mother of Theodore Roosevelt's. Martha Mittie Bullock was Theodore Roosevelt's mother and Eleanor Roosevelt's grandmother. She was the inspiration for Scarlett O'Hara, which is not entirely a compliment if you think about it. She was witty and sharp-tongued. She had these interesting turns of phrase, very coy in terms of her impulsive personality. It was actually Mittie who introduced Theodore to the McGuffey Readers, which were a series of books that had all these great phrases, including the African proverb, speak softly and carry a big stick. So it was Mittie, his mother, who was introducing him to probably what would be known as his infectious, ebullient personality. And it was also Mittie who was responsible for taking care of Theodore. You know, he was a sickly, asthmatic child, which I'll talk about in a moment, and it was Mittie who would literally massage Theodore Roosevelt's chest until the blood would come out. She was the one who took him to baths and retreats and tried to treat his asthma by getting him to the outdoors. We'll hear about Theodore Roosevelt's father, Thee, in a moment, but he had a very different approach to his son. You know, he would smoke cigars and blow the smoke in his face to try to help with the asthma. He took him on midnight rides to try to get him fresh air, which, you know, sleeplessness and cigar smoke, not a good cure for asthma. So it's actually, you know, his mother who was really the caretaker, and we'll get into sort of how that evolves into his adolescence. Also significantly, Mittie, though she was born in Connecticut, was actually a Southerner. She was raised almost her entire life in Georgia, Roswell, Georgia. That's the inspiration for Scarlett O'Hara. And she was a devout Confederate and Southerner. She moved to New York with her husband after their marriage, and she never lost her belief in the Confederacy. She had two brothers who fought for the Confederacy, and so dastardly were their deeds that they were among the very few who were not granted amnesty by the United States government. Irvine and James. I mean, James, her stepbrother, actually lived, both of them lived the rest of their life in England, but it was, you know, he was considered to be the forerunner of the Secret Service of the Confederacy. He was rumored to have helped finance the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. So when we say that they were a part of the Confederacy, they were a deep part of the Confederacy. Yeah, so she is separated from her brothers, and her mother and sister both move to New York upon the outbreak of the Civil War. So amazingly, Theodore Roosevelt, as a young child, is actually outnumbered in his household by Southern sympathizers in the stronghold of the Union, New York City. He's also surrounded by women during his entire childhood. His father is mostly away, and we'll talk about what he's doing during the Civil War, so he's really raised by women. Mittie has 4 children in 6 years. She is widowed pretty young in her life. Thee will die when Theodore Roosevelt is 20 years old. And it's Mittie who instills her family with the motto, live for the living and not for the dead. So, you know, she says, you would dishonor your father if you didn't live an honorable life of your own. And so really, if you think about it, the two most defining characteristics of Theodore Roosevelt, his ability to connect and empathize with an audience and to have that witty personality, and his resilience through life's inevitable disappointments are entirely due to Mittie's influence. So then I just want to talk a little bit about the contrast between Mittie and her husband, Thee. So Mittie is impulsive. She's got a lively tongue, as her brother says. And her husband, Thee, is very stern. It's her brother-in-law who will say of the two, between Mittie's liveliness and your solemnity, you make an even match. It's like the old cliche goes, opposites attract. So let's talk a little bit about TR's childhood. Theodore Roosevelt as a child, as I mentioned, is severely asthmatic. He likes the natural sciences and taxidermy. And as he's growing, he develops the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History. He's an odd child, and Mittie recognizes that he needs friends. So she will actually be the one that introduces Edith Carreau, his future second wife, to the Roosevelt family, and she becomes a bit of a bonus sister. And it's Theodore's father who, late in his adolescence, around 12, 13 years old, will say to him, you have the mind, but not the body. If you want your mind to go as far as it can, you must make your body. And it's really at this point that Theodore breaks from his mother, not uncommon during adolescence, that there will be a moment where he begins to reject the kind of approach that his mother had, which was this loving, caring, very thoughtful concern for his health, to his father's approach to build his body, not just his mind. So there's a lot of dynamics and reasons that Mittie, who has really been entirely written off by history. I mean, if you read prior biographies of Theodore Roosevelt, you hear about the exaltation of Thee and very little about the influence of Mittie. So let's talk about Thee for a moment, because he's an extraordinary man. I mean, he deserves all the accolades that he gets in history. He is the co-founder of the American Museum of Natural History. He too, of course, is Theodore Roosevelt's father and Eleanor Roosevelt's grandfather. He is, as I mentioned, a stern disciplinarian. He's a devout Christian, and he believes in a form of Christianity that's becoming very popular at this time, known as muscular Christianity. So this is the time when the YMCA will come into being. This is the time when you'll begin to see depictions of Jesus as larger, beefier, bigger. It's a time when, as the society changes from an agrarian to an industrial society, the highest levels of the elite in the Victorian age or the Gilded Age are really looking for new ways to prove their manhood. And this becomes this ethos of Thee's. He believes in the Christian belief that to whom much is given, much is required. And he instills his children with that belief. He'll form an orthopedic hospital, the first of its kind in New York City, because Bamie, his eldest daughter, whom we'll talk about in a moment, is born with a spinal defect. He's the founder of the American Museum of Natural History, as mentioned. He's focused on these philanthropic efforts rather than the finances of the family, because they are wealthy enough that he can do so. He did hire a substitute during the Civil War. Mittie's brothers, as I mentioned, were fighting for the Confederacy, and she forbade him from fighting for the Union. But he did do other work, and I'm going to talk about one of the remarkable discoveries in the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt in just a moment. He died very unexpectedly of cancer at age 46, and it absolutely stunned Theodore Roosevelt. So as I mentioned, during his formative years, in his childhood years, Mittie is the caretaker for young Theodore. Then there's this moment in adolescence where his father challenges him to make his body, and a mere 7 years later, he's gone. So whatever exalted position Thee held in his son's mind, it went to an even higher echelon because, of course, he was gone too soon from his life. So I want to talk to you about one of the new discoveries in the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt. So remarkably, There were 11 letters that had been locked in a safe since 1954 and never opened. Harvard called the discovery of these letters perhaps the most remarkable discovery since Theodore Roosevelt's death. And it was pure happenstance that this safe happened to be opened while I was doing the research for the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt. And in it, in one of the 11 letters, is the earliest possible and earliest known letter from Thee to his young son. He's writing a 3-year-old Theodore Roosevelt. And he's writing after he has come out of a meeting with President Lincoln. And he remarks on this image. So the date, hard to see from where you are, is Washington, D.C., December 31st, 1861. This is right at the start of the Civil War. And he says, "Dear Titi, this is a picture of a horse, much like the statue outside Grandpa's. I have just come from a meeting with the president who governs our whole nation. And he has told me to go out and see all the soldiers of our state and see if they might send money back to their families." And then he says, there is an inscription on this statue. I want your mother to read it to you and for you to learn it by heart, so when I get home, you can repeat it back to me. And the statue says, the Federal Union, it must be preserved. It's remarkable. You have, the father of Theodore Roosevelt, the grandfather of Eleanor Roosevelt, writing to the future president of the United States about the executive mansion. Later, the Roosevelts will rename it the White House. And this statue still stands to this day outside in Lafayette Square, outside the White House. It also tells you a little bit about the relationship between Thee and Mittie, because he's getting a dig in there, right? He's saying to his Southern wife, please read this, the Federal Union, it must be preserved, and learn it by heart so you can repeat it when I get home. And they had a fascinating dynamic. There's hundreds and hundreds of love letters between Thee and Mittie. They had a really devoted relationship. I mean, I think the key here is also to remember that Theodore Roosevelt and his sisters were growing up in a house divided, in a nation divided. And they were witnessing their parents disagreeing without being disagreeable. They couldn't have possibly disagreed on something more important than the Civil War and the future of the Union. Yet they stayed together as a family unit, and they showed their children how they could navigate through this thorniest of political issues. I want to talk for just a moment. It's not the focus of the book, but I do want to mention Theodore Roosevelt's younger brother, Elliot, because he does, of course, become the father of Eleanor Roosevelt. He was dashing and sociable. He was more popular and fun than Theodore Roosevelt. Anybody who writes about Elliot and Theodore as children will inevitably say that if you want to spend time with one of the Roosevelt brothers, you want to party with Ellie. He's the one you want to have fun with. He's more stereotypical of the life in the Gilded Age of privilege. He did not attend college. But what we've later discovered about Elliot is that he likely suffered from undiagnosed epilepsy, and that he self-medicated that epilepsy with an extraordinary amount of drugs and alcohol. He will, in fact, die at age 34, leaving Eleanor and her brother orphans by age 10. Actually, Theodore and his sister Bamie contemplate for a while adopting Eleanor until the Hall side of the family, his wife's side of the family, do indeed take her in. So just a brief note on the life of Elliot, because in many ways, Theodore Roosevelt looked for what I call psychological mirrors in his life. People that he respected, perhaps loved, but didn't in any way want to be like. And that very much is the definition of his relationship with his brother Elliot. He deeply loved him, he deeply respected him, but he saw him going down a path that he never wanted to go down. The same kind of relationship happened in Harvard with his closest Harvard classmate, Henry Davis Minot. Henry Davis Minot and Theodore Roosevelt were extraordinarily close. They wrote a book on ornithology together. They didn't live together, but they were everywhere together in their first 2 years. And Henry Davis Minot will suffer a complete mental breakdown. He sends this heartbreaking letter to his psychologist and therapist saying, I have want of being manly, and I don't know how to do it. And sadly, the letter is never opened. It's never read. His doctor had sailed to Europe before he had the chance to read it. So he drops out of Harvard, and Theodore is sort of left with this best friend who's also struggling with how to be manly in his life, which is so interesting, again, when you're thinking about this consequential year of 1878. So in a single year, 1878, this is Theodore Roosevelt's second year at Harvard. In February of that year, his father will succumb to stomach cancer. And it's a horrible death in which he goes very quickly, and Theodore does not make it back from Harvard to say goodbye to his father. And for the rest of his life, Theodore will blame Eliot for not telling him, alerting him, sending a telegram in time so he can come back from Cambridge in time to say goodbye to his father. Just another one of the dynamics between these brothers. But you know, then in August of that year, he is expected to be engaged to his childhood sweetheart, Edith, whom we're going to meet in a moment. And he doesn't, and I'll tell you a little bit about why. But I want to just also frame that at this point, you have to remember that Theodore Roosevelt is not the Theodore Roosevelt we know from Mount Rushmore. At 20 years old, Theodore Roosevelt is a geeky naturalist. He is more interested in arsenic than alcohol. He is literally smells like formaldehyde. I mean, his classmates at Harvard, the descriptions of him given long after Theodore had been president of the United States in oral interviews to historians will say he was half crazy. You know, he was uncool. You know, he was a strange kind of person at this age. So to try to imagine Theodore Roosevelt at that age, it's kind of remarkable. He's lost his father. He's got this best friend who's dropped out of Harvard. There's these constant themes of manliness in his life, and it's always the women who are there to pick him up. And, you know, what's fascinating about the death of Thee is that as he writes in his diary, Theodore Roosevelt begins to say, there's no one in whom I can possibly confide or be as close with as I was with my father, except for a wife. So somehow he's substituting a wife that he hasn't yet met for his father. And he actually quotes from the Raven. He wonders who his wife will be. He says, a rare and radiant maiden, I hope, which is clearly from Edgar Allan Poe's famous poem, The Raven, which is about, oddly, a dead lover. So, you know, try and get inside Theodore Roosevelt's mind in 1878. He's lost his father, and he is writing in his diary about how he will meet his wife and what his wife will be like. And he's imagining her through the lens of Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. Enter Edith Corot. So as I mentioned, Edie Corot and Theodore were friends since Edith had been 3 years old. So Theodore Roosevelt will only live to 60 years old. They knew each other for 57 years of Theodore's life. It's remarkable. She was in some ways considered a bonus sister. She was always around, very close with Theodore Roosevelt's younger sister, whom I'll talk about in a moment. And the important thing to remember about Edie is that the Corots, as their fortunes declined, the Roosevelts were steadily increasing. So she was always on the outside of the inner circle. There are these excruciating moments in Edie's young life where she is writing about how the Roosevelt children are going to come over, and she wants to hide all of her shabby toys. You know, she's known for better judgment. In fact, it'll later be Theodore Roosevelt who says, whenever I go against her judgment, I regret it. That's a sentiment that a lot of husbands and wives have related to, as I've been talking about the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt. And I like to say that she was the first love and second wife of Theodore. And we'll talk about how she became the first modern First Lady. But go back to 1878. So his father has died, and he's wondering in his diary who his wife will be. Everyone expects that it will be Edith. He goes back home the summer after his father has died, and they spend her 17th birthday together. He buys her flowers, they go picking water lilies, they go out for a rowboat ride, and then they ascend a hill in Oyster Bay known as Tranquility. Now, that's an ironic title because whenever the Roosevelts were there, it was anything but tranquil. And what happened on August 22nd, 1878, remains a historical mystery. Something happened in that room between Edith and Theodore that blew up their relationship seemingly forever. They will only speak about it very rarely in their life again and take the secret to their grave. Of the occasion, Theodore will later write to his sister Bamie that they had, and I suppose have, tempers far from being the best. And Edith will say of Theodore that he had simply not been nice. Now later, much later in life, Edith will claim that Theodore proposed and she rejected him. But this doesn't really add up because it was the Victorian tradition for a woman to demur the first time that a man proposed, and then naturally he would propose again. So that doesn't really explain what happened. This is why we need an adaptation of the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, because I don't have the historical information to verify what happened in that room, but it would be great to speculate. Nonetheless, Theodore Roosevelt's father dies in February. He breaks up with his childhood sweetheart in August, and all of a sudden, enter Alice Hathaway Lee. 2 months after he breaks up with Edith, he meets the most eligible bachelorette in all of Boston. I don't know if you're familiar with the Boston toast, and this is good old Boston, the home of the bean and the cod, where the Lowells talk only to the Cabots, and the Cabots talk only to God. She's a Cabot. All right? She comes from the lineage and the line of the most distinguished citizens of all of Boston. And just like today, Bostonians and Knickerbockers don't always mix, Bostonians and New Yorkers. So, you know, I talk about in the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt how a Knickerbocker is from 1821, Washington Irving, writing about the original families who are coming in and founding New Amsterdam, right? The Boston Brahmins, Brahmin is literally the highest caste of Hindu priest, right? That is a caste-based system. You cannot enter it, no matter how much wealth you have. So this was this geeky naturalist in whose wake formaldehyde lingers, chasing after the most eligible bachelorette in all of Boston. She's beautiful, she's beguiling. She's written off in history as a privileged Victorian who had no consequence in Theodore Roosevelt. I think of her as sort of more like Audrey or Kate Hepburn. She's athletic, outgoing, she's opinionated and intellectual. She was a part of this progressive, reform-minded family, and she steers Theodore Roosevelt away from natural science and toward politics for the very first time. She was known, her nickname was Sunshine. So lively and engaging was her personality that she was the light that entered the room when everyone else was in it. So Theodore pursues her absolutely madly. I mean, imagine being the object of Theodore Roosevelt's affections. He pursued her for 2 years. He spent the modern day equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars on trinkets and jewelry. He had a horse that he rode so hard to the 12 miles round trip to Chestnut Hill that when he lamed the horse, he finally bought a dog cart so he could go in the 1870s equivalent of a roadster to her home. And when that broke down, he would walk the 12 miles to her home to see Alice. And the thing he wanted most was this. He wanted a tintype. He wanted a photograph. When you had a photograph, you were essentially coming out as a couple. And he worked for 6 months to get this photograph, and the first one they took was this one on the right, your left. And of course, there in the middle, because she has not come out in society yet, is her cousin. So, you know, look at the face of Theodore Roosevelt at this moment, 6 months, and he's got his cousin, her cousin, in between them. So he devises to get a second photograph, and look who suddenly found himself in the middle with the cousin on the outside, and his arm, his right arm, is just ever so close to touching Alice Hathaway Lee. He finally does succeed in winning the hand of Alice Hathaway Lee, in part because of the women in the arena for him. He relies on his sisters. He relies on Bamie, his older sister, and Conie, his younger sister, and his mother, whom we've already met, Mittie. I think for all the reasons that Alice finally succumbed and fell in love with Theodore, it was as much her falling in love with the Roosevelt women as it was falling in love with him. They traveled to Chestnut Hill and spent time together, and then the Lees went to New York and spent time with the Roosevelts. I mean, Theodore was losing his mind chasing Alice. He was wandering the woods of Cambridge, threatening duels with suitors, and they had to send a cousin to Cambridge to bring him back because he was so beside himself that his love quest was failing. But when his sisters stepped in and when Mittie stepped in, Alice saw this incredible family that she could be a part of. Interestingly, he is engaged on February 14th, 1880, Valentine's Day, and shortly thereafter, in June of that year, he writes The Practicability of Men and Women Having Equal Rights. So with the influence of Alice, in his senior thesis, he endorses suffrage 40 years before the 19th Amendment passes. He says that women should be doctors and judges. He says that women should own property, that they should not necessarily take their husband's name upon marriage. This is all the influence of Alice and that progressive Boston Brahmin family, the Lees. So now you've got this really interesting mix of a family together, and it only lasts for 4 years. Alice Hathaway Lee will die on February 14th, 1884. But I want to set the stage. There's an extraordinary series of events. So I mentioned that they announced their public engagement on February 14th, 1880. So Theodore Roosevelt, once Alice is pregnant, is convinced that providentially, obviously, it will happen that his baby, their baby, will be born on February 14th, 1884, the anniversary of their engagement. So on February 11th, he makes the decision to go back to Albany and attend to his business at the New York State Assembly. And now remember, for those who believe that Alice had no influence on him, he had won his first elected office. He had won re-election twice. He was the youngest New York State Assemblyman in history to this date with Alice. He wrote his first book, The Naval War of 1812, during this time, and in his own words, he rose like a rocket. So they were very, very successful together as a couple. On February 11th, he goes back to Albany. He receives the first telegram that says the baby has been born on February 12th and that Alice is only fairly well. And he knows that his mother is also sick at this time, but she's expected to recover. So he doesn't make a move to go back to New York. Then a second telegram arrives, and history has lost the contents of that telegram, but we know Theodore Roosevelt's reaction. His face went ashen white, and he ran from the State Assembly to the train station in Albany. He took an excruciating 5.5-hour trip home to New York City. Normally that trip would take 2 to 2.5 hours, but there was a thick, dense fog that had descended over New York City. So thick that the New York Times wrote that it was suicidal weather. You couldn't see 2 inches in front of your face. So when he got to Grand Central Station, he had to walk, not take a hansom cab, to 6 West 57th Street, where his brother Elliot had said, "There is a curse on this house. Mother is dying, and Alice is dying too." He ran to the 3rd floor. He held Alice in his arms until 2:30 in the morning. The clock had struck midnight, and it was now the fateful day, February 14th, 1884, 4 years to the day when he had been engaged to Alice. They said, "Mother is dying, you need to come to the second floor." They gathered around Mittie, and she succumbed to typhoid fever at 2:30 in the morning. He then went back up to the third floor, and he clasped Alice for 11 hours until she too died at 1:30 in the afternoon. So on the date that he expected his baby would be born, he lost his mother and his wife on the same day in the same house. Now, one of the new discoveries is that it's been written that Alice, only with him for 6 years, only married for 4, had no consequence on his life. What was not available to Edmund Morris or David McCullough when they wrote their extraordinary books in the late 1970s, early 1980s, Mornings on Horseback and the Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, Mornings on Horseback deservedly, Rise of Theodore Roosevelt deservedly winning the Pulitzer Prize, they didn't have 24 letters, love letters, between Theodore and Alice that established the closeness of their relationship. And Theodore is saying, "I talk over everything with Alice, from politics to poetry." He tries out some of his earliest political lines on her, including the forerunner of what will become the In the Arena speech. And then we made this remarkable discovery. This has never been written about. It's written about for the first time in the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt. I was at Sagamore Hill working with the National Park Service, trying to discover any relic of Alice. I mean, she died at 22, and she wasn't married at that point to the President of the United States, so her record has largely disappeared, except for this. We opened what looks like almost a Tiffany box, a blue-green teal box, and it said Alice Hair. And on the first layer, indeed, that's exactly what it was. It was ringlets of her hair from 8 months old, with her mother's handwriting saying Alice's hair, 8 months old. Alice's hair, 9 years old. But under the second layer of the box, we opened it up and for the first time discovered this. About 16 inches of Alice Hathaway Lee's hair, and a note in the unmistakable handwriting of Theodore Roosevelt that said, "The hair of my sweet wife Alice, cut after death." He kept this box for the rest of his life with pictures of Alice, including the one that I showed you earlier, and hid it from Edith, his second wife, never to show her that he kept this keepsake of Alice forever. So I want to talk a bit about Bamie. Bamie is this extraordinary influence in Theodore Roosevelt's life. So Bamie, the older sister, is the one who will take care of the daughter, Alice, when Theodore flees for the Badlands. He doesn't run for re-election to the New York State Assembly. He goes to the Badlands of North Dakota, lives as a rancher and a cowboy for the better part of 2 years. And it's Bamie, his older sister, that is left to pick up the pieces. Bamie sells the house at 6 West 57th Street. Bamie oversees the construction of what will become Sagamore Hill. And Bamie, very importantly, will take care of his baby for 3 years. You know, if you want to talk about pre-verbal psychic scars, you know, Theodore Roosevelt abandoned his daughter for basically 3 years and into the care of Bamie. She was his older sister and strategic advisor. I like to say that Bamie was like what Robert F. Kennedy was to John F. Kennedy. They were siblings, but she was able to see the political chessboard in a way that he just simply couldn't. You know, in fact, Alice Roosevelt Longworth, the daughter, will later say of Bamie, "I always believed that she, rather than my father, had she been a man, would have been president of the United States." And Eleanor Roosevelt has later asked about that quote, and she says, "I very easily think that might have been so." She suffered that spinal defect as a child that led Thea to found the orthopedic hospital. So she was also someone who was teaching her younger brother how to will through physical pain. She and her home at 1733 N Street was known as the Little White House. He would walk 10 minutes to her home and consult with her on every single major decision that he ever made. She was married in her late 40s and had her first child at 42 in 1898. So she really dedicated most of her adult life to Theodore Roosevelt's success. And then his younger sister, Conie. I just want to remark on just this incredible woman. She's the younger sister and confidant. She's an accomplished poet and author. Eleanor Roosevelt put it best when she said, "You went to Bamie for advice. You went to Conie for sympathy." Right? This was the empathetic sister. She was the more emotional one. She was the one that Theodore could turn to when he had an outburst of impulse, which was pretty often. She was his emotional outlet and source of empathy and sympathy. But they also very cleverly took advantage of the misogyny of the era. What they would do, particularly when Theodore Roosevelt was governor of New York, is Conie would host breakfasts, and the bosses, the political bosses, would come. And then finally the political bosses would say, all right, everybody, clear out now. I need my time with the governor. And Theodore would say, well, obviously my sister can stay. I mean, what consequence would it be to have a woman in the room? She's so interested in all that I do. So she would stay, and she would knit or sew in the corner, and she would hear everything they discussed, to the point where when he finished his gubernatorial time in New York, he said to Conie, haven't we had fun being governor of New York? That's how influential Conie was. She was also his press secretary before the role existed. So Conie knew that if the public fell in love with Theodore Roosevelt, then he could accomplish all he wanted in politics. So she slipped stories of his heroics in Cuba to the press. She's the one who slipped stories of that hectic family life of the Roosevelts in the White House to the press, often over Edith's objections. So she's, you know, she's just this, again, think about how these women work together to make Theodore Roosevelt possible. When you have a political strategist like Bamie and an empathetic person who understands the press at a time before even any news cycles existed. So then I want to bring us back to Edith. So what happens? He goes out to Dakota. He's lost his wife and mother. Bamie is taking care of everything. And re-enter Edith Kermit Carew. He says to Bamie, the one person I don't want to see when I come back from North Dakota is Edith. He knows why. As soon as they see each other again, they fall instantly back in love. And they are secretly engaged. They don't tell anybody about their engagement. They eventually are married in London, and on the marriage certificate, Edith puts as her career, her occupation, spinster. She was waiting for somehow, some way to marry Theodore Roosevelt. It's pretty extraordinary. She was, she never really dated anyone else. She very much believed that somehow he would be her husband. She was on the outside of this inner circle, right? She goes from being the bonus sister to being his wife, his closest advisor. And, I love this quote about Edith. It says, Mrs. Roosevelt is more difficult of access. Praise does not reach or define her. As there's another great quote that says, as soon as the camera comes into focus, she steps aside just as the shutter clicks. She had that harder life. She didn't grow up with privilege. She was always watching the Roosevelts ascend and go on these grand vacations and have this seemingly perfect family life while hers was declining. And she actually burned much of her correspondence with Theodore. In fact, the day that she died, her daughter discovered her burning letters. And many of the reasons we don't have the letters between Edith and Theodore in the Morris and McCullough and other volumes is because they kept them hidden for many, many years, knowing that it was Edith's wish that they not be seen by history. Also kind of an interesting thing as she goes through life, she has this great quote. She refers to her time as sort of raising a family as her beloved shackles. For her, family life is the all-consuming continuum of her existence. And she says later of her grandchildren, I just have to share this because it's such a great quote, I like to see their little faces, but I prefer to see their backs. So, it's a kind of a different personality. You couldn't find two more different women on the face of the earth than Alice and Edith, and Theodore married both of them in the space of 7 years. So I want to talk about, as I wrap up, I want to talk about the dynamic of these relationships. I mean, again, you've got Bamie, who's the strategic advisor. You've got Alice, who gets him interested in politics instead of natural science, and who introduces him to the progressive, reform-minded causes that he'll later be famous for. You have Conie, who's his press secretary before the time, and you have Edith, who serves as his most strategic advisor. I mean, she's the one who'll read 4 or 5 newspapers every morning. She'll literally transform the White House. She creates the West Wing and the East Wing. She plants a colonial garden that'll become the Rose Garden. She entertains 40,000 guests her first year in the White House. She is the person who's, again, universally known for better judgment than TR. I mean, FDR said it best when he said, Aunt Edith managed Theodore very cleverly without his being conscious of it. No slight achievement anyone will concede. And then before I go, I just want to make sure that we touch upon one of the most famous Roosevelts. It's not one of the 5 women that I'm talking primarily about in the book, but Alice Roosevelt Longworth, the daughter, first born in 1884 and last to die in 1980. So the daughter that is born, right, 1980, she knew every president from her father to Gerald Ford, and talked with, on the audio version of the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, there's a remarkable conversation between Alice and Richard Nixon, in which Richard Nixon says, you know, I've just turned 60 years old. I'm too old for this job. And she reminds him that her father died at 60 years old. So thank you, Alice, for that interesting remark. She was known as the second Washington Monument, and of course, Alice and her father traded incredible barbs. It was said of Alice by Theodore, I can either run the country or I can control Alice, but I cannot possibly do both. And then, of course, she gave as good as she got. Alice said that you know, Theodore wanted to be the bride at every wedding, the corpse at every funeral, and the baby at every christening. So that's the wit of father and daughter that they exchanged. And it was Alice who actually donated the 24 love letters between her mother and her father, Alice and Theodore, that are revealed in the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt. And I can't end a talk in Ohio without a little talk about Ohio. So just so we know, in 1900, William McKinley, of course, is the President of the United States seeking re-election. His vice president unexpectedly dies, and over many, many objections, which we can certainly talk about in the Q&A, Theodore Roosevelt becomes his vice presidential candidate. They win in Ohio. McKinley is a native son of Ohio. They win, but only by about 75,000 votes. And interestingly, in 1904, when Theodore Roosevelt is running on his own, he actually exceeds the total that he and McKinley achieved with about the same number of total of votes, but he wins more votes in Ohio than the McKinley ticket did in 1900. And then I thought it was really interesting. I had to show you this. Of course, there's this great cartoon, Ohio, the mother of presidents, with Theodore and Taft fighting over Ohio. So Taft is another native son of Ohio, and it's expected that he will win the presidential primary, the Republican primary in Ohio. It's a split delegate. He loses. Amazingly, TR tops him in the Republican primary in Ohio, 165,809 votes to 118,362. But then they go to the convention, and they refuse to seat the Ohio delegates for Theodore. So they come up with these cards, how to vote for Roosevelt. So they indicate this is instruction card for Ohio delegates to the Republican National Convention 1912, and this actually becomes the difference. The fact that they don't recognize the Ohio delegates at the Republican Convention means TR is denied the nomination. He, of course, then bolts the party, runs as a bull moose progressive independent, and the rest is history. I will point out that in the general election of 1912, Wilson won the state of Ohio with 424,000 votes. Taft and TR, if you added up their totals in Ohio, the Republican would have taken the state. As Ohio goes, so goes the nation. Because they split the ticket, Ohio did not go to the Republican, went to Wilson, the Democrat, and he became president. So with that, I'm glad you have met the women in the arena, and I hope we can have a good conversation about the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, we're going to take some questions. I'm going to see if I can try and pass the microphone around here so that everybody can hear. So who's got a burning question? Okay.
I always have a concern about the written history, that we, from past years, have that wonderful, the letters, the correspondence that we can go back to and look at. How is our history going to look now with our delete, delete, delete?
It's pretty extraordinary.
Emails and texts and things like that.
Right. Well, my day job is as the CEO of the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library Foundation, and we're actually constructing the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library right now in Medora, North Dakota. It'll be open July 4th, 2026, the 250th anniversary of America. And Theodore Roosevelt's record is, spread to the winds amongst 70 different institutions across the world. Barack Obama's archive and what will become the Obama Center is 95% digitally native. Of course, there's lots of paper archives and lots of letters and notes and stationery, but it's primarily email correspondence and text correspondence. How historians will decipher an emoji in the future, that's what we'll be up here decipher 50 years from now at the Hudson Library. What did they mean by heart? Did they really like it? Did they not like it? So I agree with you. It's a real concern.
What you have described is a grand life all over the country and blended together. But what was the actual source of the Roosevelts' wealth?
Ooh, great question. And I love the mic. Everyone can hear the question. Normally I repeat it, but you can hear it. Okay. So they were one of the oldest families. They were one of the original Dutch families that came over in the 1600s. I mean, you could date the lineage of the Roosevelts all the way back to the first immigrants arriving into New Amsterdam. They started as traders. They did a lot of stained glass. So if you go to the Roosevelt Boyhood Home, for instance, or even at Sagamore Hill, the sliding glass doors have these beautiful ornate colors that then Theodore Roosevelt will mimic and imitate at Sagamore Hill as a nod to the family. But it's really the grandfather, CVS Roosevelt, who switches them into finance. He is one of the original trustees of Chemical Bank, which will eventually become Chase Bank. And that's where they had a lot of wealth up to that point, but it explodes to a new echelon with CVS Roosevelt in the 1820s, 1830s. And each of his sons, he had 4 sons, he bought them each a townhome when they got married. And so that's how wealthy they were, right? And literally at 28 East 20th, where the Boyhood Home is now, you're about 3 blocks from where Edith Jones was located, and they would move continually uptown. That's the origin of the phrase, keeping up with the Joneses. And Jones' married name, Edith Wharton. So Edith Wharton grew up about 3 blocks from Theodore Roosevelt. She was almost the same age as Connie. They all knew each other, Edie, Connie, Edith Wharton, and he will correspond with her his entire life. So, I mean, that tells you the kind of wealth. And that's why they moved to 6 West 57th Street. They kept moving uptown with the tide of wealth. But it was really banking and finance after being traders for over 100 years.
I can project.
It's a good job.
Hathaway's cause of death? I don't think I heard.
So Alice Hathaway Lee's cause of death was Bright's disease, which is a kidney malfunction. So it was exacerbated by childbirth. But of course, there was no autopsy. And so interestingly, I'm now working with the National Park Service, given the voluminous amount of hair that has been discovered and the fact that it is follicle hair, we could run a DNA test and determine for certain that that was indeed the cause of death. We're still working through whether and how that will happen. They did this with Beethoven, actually. If you saw, it's Beethoven's hair. They did the test, and then they discovered what they suspected, that he drank too much. But yes, it'd be great to know for certain how she died.
Early in his life, he was sickly. But I read a lot of stories about he started a lot of the national parks, and he was this Rough Rider. How did that transition happen? I mean, was he on a program? Who stepped in to take him from this sickly child to this Rough Rider?
Well, it's a fascinating combination of Mittie and Thee and his sisters. I mean, the Roosevelts believed in a strenuous life. There are these stories of them going to Europe and hiking for, they mark how long they've hiked. And you know, Mittie is supposed to be bedridden and this Victorian doll. She hikes 12, 14 miles a day with the family. I mean, they literally 12, 14 miles. So, you know, on his honeymoon, Theodore Roosevelt hiked the Matterhorn. And remarks on it in his diary that it was like going up and down stairs on your hands and knees for 9 hours, but still makes dinner that night with Alice. So, you know, I think there's this interesting kind of combination where in his early childhood, he's so sickly. I mean, the first words I write in the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt was that from the beginning, the survival of Theodore Roosevelt was very much in doubt. That is not hyperbole. His mother believed he was going to die, and she babied him. She took care of him. She, you know, did anything and everything to ensure his survival. And then when he got strong enough and he got through that early childhood, he rejected her and said, you know, I want to build my body. I want to be a strong man. And then this kind of collides with this muscular Christianity of the age, and you know, his brother becoming a severe alcoholic and him wanting to be of sound mind and sound body. You know, so I think it was a combination of this early influence of Mittie really protecting him and making sure he lived to see adulthood, and then Thee stepping in and saying, you know, if you don't make your body, your mind is just not going to be capable of all that it can do. So it was really a combination of both of them, and history has really only said it was Thee. You know, it was all about his strenuous activity, but I do think it was a combination of both.
Oh, I don't need that. I can do that. Was it Teddy Roosevelt's grandson who married Edith Cummings' daughter?
Yes, that's on the, you're testing my knowledge, but it's on the Kermit Roosevelt line. Yes.
Yeah, it was interesting.
Yes.
And they had 3 or 4 children, didn't they?
Well, and the kind of sad part of that line is Kermit and Theodore are so incredibly close. When Theodore Roosevelt dies at age 60, everybody's very sad. The family knew he was sick, but the public did not. I mean, to the public, the leading candidate for the presidential nomination in 1920 had just died. Right? It was a shock to the nation. But his family, you know, he's very, very close with Kermit. All the letters from his daughter Ethel, even Edith, will say, I'm very sad about Father, I'm very sad about Theodore, but I'm really worried about Kermit. And Kermit will actually eventually die by suicide in the 1940s during World War II. And they lie to Edith. They tell her that he died of a heart attack, and she never knows the truth. She goes to her grave probably good that she didn't know her son died that way.
By the way, I really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
It was fascinating.
Thank you.
I just want, could you just say which child and who everybody is in that photo?
Oh, sure. Okay. All right. Now okay, so the tallest is the easiest, right? Because that's Alice Roosevelt Longworth. And by the way, I'll just quickly say that Alice Roosevelt Longworth will marry Nicholas Longworth, who's the Speaker of the House from Ohio. And they have a terrible marriage, unfortunately. She will, her husband is running for re-election in Ohio during the 1912 campaign, and she forbids Alice from going to the Progressive Bull Moose Convention. And it's the one and only time that Alice ever did as she was told in that case, but she was furious. Later has an affair, and the child that she has is not Nicholas Longworth. That's later revealed. So there's Alice. That's Alice. Next to her is Ted Jr. Ted Jr. Obviously, you have TR. You've got Archibald, his young son there. You've got Quentin is the youngest. We've got Ethel, who's the second daughter, and Kermit. So Kermit's here. This is Kermit. Quentin, Archie, Ethel, Ted, and Alice. So, I mean, and they all have fascinating lives. I mean, Quentin dies in World War I. It breaks Theodore Roosevelt's heart. He never really I mean, that's the final blow. He was physically really degraded from living a strenuous life, but when Quentin dies, and Quentin was the darling of the White House. I mean, he was born in 1898, so, you know, during the White House years, you know, TR is 42, Edith is in her late 30s. I mean, they're younger than JFK and Jackie. Think about that. I mean, that's how vibrant this family was, and then, you know, Quentin dies at 19 years old. So the nation had grown up watching him grow up in the White House. That was a good test, by the way.
Why did everybody have a nickname?
Oh, oh my God. Why did everybody have a nickname? I mean, it's the blessing and curse. You know, and I'm told by my wife many times, like, slow down, remember to, and they all named each other the same names, right? Alice, that was one of the things that I wondered about when I started the research, is if Theodore Roosevelt expunged his wife from his life, why would he name his child Alice? I mean, you know, just start there. You know, it's a loving family, and they did all have similar names. I mean, they used the family names again and again through the generations, and so they had to have nicknames to distinguish them from their forebears. But, you know, some of them were playful nicknames, like Bamie is short for Bambina. That's the, you know, they just, yeah, exactly. I should have explained that one. That one, it's in the book. It's short for Bambina. Yeah.
Okay, 2 more questions. I'm going to ask the next to the last one. So one I've been holding on to is in one of my history classes, I don't know how true this is, but somebody told me that during the First World War, Theodore Roosevelt wanted to go fight in France, and Wilson said, no, if you do that, I'm going to ban you from the Army. How true is that?
That is a 100% true story. It is in the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt. Not only did, by the way, when Theodore Roosevelt was vice president for 6 months, he presided over the Senate for 5 days, and then the Senate went into recess. And for 6 months, he wrote letter after letter about how useless this job is, how miserable he is, how they should abolish the office of the vice presidency. And miraculously, he invites Woodrow Wilson to Sagamore Hill, and they have a conference on all sorts of civil matters. So his later avowed enemy, Woodrow Wilson, actually, they met at Sagamore Hill in the in 1901. But that is true. No, he did. Theodore went to the White House. I write about it in the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt. He pleads with Wilson to raise an army. He wants to die triumphantly on the field of battle. Wilson denies him the opportunity to become, because he'll probably live and then come back and run against him, but knowing TR. But yes, he did ask for permission and was denied to serve in World War I.
Okay.
I understand that TR was deaf in one ear for
Yes.
boxing
That is true.
in the basement of the White House.
That is also a
Could
true
you tell
story.
me? Could you tell me who his competitor was?
Oh. Yeah, Wilson. I don't recall. I do know that he was sparring often. He had a jujitsu teacher that would come to the White House, and I want to say that it might have been the jujitsu teacher. It was one of his instructors that he would often box with fellow cabinet members, and I don't think that he was struck so hard that he went deaf. He was slowly losing his hearing, and then he got hit pretty hard in the ear in that boxing match and went, you know, it got worse over time. But I don't recall exactly who he was boxing with. It wasn't one of the women, I know that. If it was one of the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, I would know the answer.
Well, thanks for coming out.
Thank you.